This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Less than 1% of U.S. wineries are Black-owned. That's according to the Journal of Business Diversity. For centuries, the wine industry has been overwhelmingly white. But that's starting to change. More makers, lovers, and sellers of color are entering the industry. And that's changing who consumes and enjoys wine too. Today, we're talking about making the wine industry more inclusive with the people who make, sell, and love it. With us is Marissa Ocasio. She's the Director of Education at Central Wine and Spirits in Glastonbury, and Donna Moore, winemaker at the Sunset Hill Vineyard in Lyme, Connecticut. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Hello.
Thank you.
And with us as well is Jennifer Reagan-Lefebvre, who's the professor of history at Trinity College here in Connecticut. She's also the author of the book Imperial Wine, How the British Empire Made Wine's New World. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for being with us
Good
today.
morning. My pleasure.
So I want to start the conversation off with Marissa. Your love of wine actually began overseas in Spain, but you also grew up with flavors of Puerto Rico. So tell us about, where did your passion of wine come from?
The passion came out of realizing that I could put a couple of things together: my love of reading, research, and just growing up in a household that really treasured flavors, everything from cumin to acerola, which is a kind of cherry, to mamey and bananas and all these things. And so I realized that I could put these two things together, and that my career perhaps didn't have to be a straight line. Like when I got out of college and went into the insurance companies.
So that's quite the shift.
It is quite the shift. And it came about naturally because I just kind of found my way into it. But it was a challenge because at that time, nobody really thought that you should be in the liquor business, so to speak.
Sure. And what was the moment that you were like, this is the thing to do?
I think the true moment was when I decided to move from Connecticut to New York City. And a gentleman who had been in the sherry business for a long time referred me to a couple of shops in New York City and said, there's this shop and you'll stand there and earn $5 an hour, or you can go to this other shop where they will, help your career along and teach you more about wine. And that's where I ended up going.
And definitely want to go more in depth with that, sort of the beginnings and how that experience has been. But also, as a person of color in the wine industry, what has your experience been like, and what's the evolution been like for you?
I think when I began, there was a shock. There was always a shock, or there was, to see a woman and a person of color walk into a room or ask for the wine list, because it has usually been very white male dominated. So there was kind of that bit of a push. I worked for a large company in New York, so there's also a door that opens when you're a large company. So already there comes some power with that. But going into rooms, there were definitely questions as to what I knew. And so it does become that thing where you had to know more than you might normally know about a subject, and kind of wend your way through that. So that was a bit of a challenge. But I did see it change, and it definitely has changed in terms of being in the sales aspect, in terms of being in education. And so I think we've made some strides. Obviously, we have to make a lot more.
Right, and that's certainly something that we'll be talking about today, too. And Jennifer, as a historian, how did the journey into the history of wine start for you?
Well, I think my journey into the history of wine also started with a love of wine. And as Marissa said, a realization that if you love wine, there's always so much more to learn. So I think wine appeals to that part of me that always wants to know more and learn more, and there's a lot of excitement around that. I started writing about wine coming from a British imperial history background. I was interested to know, was it a coincidence that some of what we call the New World of wine today were British colonies initially, so Australia, South Africa, New Zealand. And I started diving deeper and realized that actually all of what we call the New World, or the kind of classical New World of wine, so I would also include Argentina, Chile, and the United States. They were all winemakers initially because they've been settled by Europeans who brought vines with them. And so I realized there was actually a strong reason to look at the colonial past of wine. I also just love to drink wine.
I mean, that's a pretty a fair assessment too. And I want to get back to sort of your background and history of wine as well. But I also want to bring in Donna Moore, who is someone who is making wine. So Donna, can you respond to what we've heard so far with how did everyone get into wine, and also talk about how did you get into wine?
Yes, definitely. I think all of the ladies are so correct as far as walking into a room, being a woman, being a brown woman. It's a little bit of a pushback, and people are surprised, and especially now because, making wine. And we have a vineyard, and people come up and do wine tasting, and immediately I'm standing right there. They will literally address the other person, my tasting room manager, who happens to be white, and she will look at them and say, yeah, you want to talk to her. You want to talk to Donna. I'm not the winemaker. And the look on their eyes is always kind of funny. The women love it. The men are a little bit taken back, and eventually they soften up. But my wine experience actually started in Margaret's River in Australia, when I was living in Australia, and just took a couple of day trips to Margaret's River, just exploring the country. And that's where I really, really fell into wine. Given the fact that I am from California, it took me to go across the river to really get into wine, which is kind of interesting. And then coming back to California, diving more and more into wine, going to Napa. I was a winemaker. It's a wine at home, I would say. I would literally, instead of Tupperware coming to your house, it would be me with 6 bottles of wine, teaching you every single thing you need to know about wine.
Well, there's a lot of smiles and nodding going around in the studio. I think what you just said resonated with all of us. I mean, who wouldn't love that, right? And and Donna, I think the theme so far is
Mhm,
there's this love of wine, and then
mhm.
it inspired you to go into either the history or the making or just being involved in it. So Donna, can you talk about, how did you go from loving wine to actually making it? Because that's a whole process.
I went into it actually when I met my husband, who, when I met him, he's Jägermeister, beer, and smoking cigarettes. And on our third date, I told him I wanted to go wine tasting. Little did I know later he wanted to break up with me because he thought I was a snob, because I wanted to take him wine tasting.
Hmm.
And we went to Paso Robles. And after a while, we realized he, number one, realized that, oh my gosh, it's just farmers. And at the time, I didn't even know he grew up on a farm. And more, we started going to Paso Robles, meeting with the winemakers, um, they were teaching us how to make wine. We harvest, we were bottling, we were running the tasting room. Every aspects of running a vineyard, we were basically doing it with them. And then, of course, later in life, I said I wanted to own a vineyard one day. And 2007, his father gave us acres in Connecticut. We moved from California back to Connecticut, started planting in 2007.
Wow, that is such a trajectory. And as a fellow Californian, let me just tell you, I was actually very surprised to see that there was a Connecticut wine trail.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was almost a little bit of home all
Mhm.
across the other side of the coast. And what has it been like for you to learn about the land and actually growing the grapes? Because that's a challenge in of itself.
Right. We were fortunate that Matt's family property, before we planted the grapes, they had livestock. So tons of livestock, cows, sheep, goats, chickens. So when we sent in our soil sample, it came back perfect. So we were very fortunate of that, because that's one aspect. That's the number one thing. When you become a grower, the first thing you have to do is check out your soil. And we were extremely fortunate that we had already ready soil because of the livestock. So that was wonderful for us. So that really wasn't a challenge. I feel like our number one challenge at that time was just trying to decide which wines grow in Connecticut and what those wines taste like. At the time when Matt was here before me, and he was gave me a list of all the different grapes that grow in Connecticut. There were so many grapes I had never heard of in my life.
Mm.
Never. So here I am in California trying to find these grapes, trying to find some wine that's made with these grapes. And that was a challenge. I'm like, how are we going to make wine with grapes I've never even heard of? And you can't find them in California because, in my mind, I mean, you can't find them in California. You can't find them anywhere.
Mhm.
So, what are they growing in Connecticut? So, I felt that was like a huge challenge. But we did narrow it down to some grapes. We knew Chardonnay because we are on a hill. So, we knew that was going to be wonderful. Cab Franc, we knew Cab Franc. So, that was great. St. Croix, that was a
Mm.
challenge. That was a big challenge. I literally had a vineyard here in Connecticut send me a bottle of this wine because I had never tasted it in my life.
Wow. And I mean, it sounds like there are so many surprises and challenges as you try to figure out how to grow or learn about grapes and what
Mhm.
kind of wine is happening here in Connecticut. So, because I mean, when you hear wine, you don't necessarily think about Connecticut first. So, no knocking on Connecticut wines, right?
Right. No knocking. And it's definitely the same when you say Connecticut, the first question, oh, I didn't know Connecticut has grapes, or I didn't know they grew grapes. Fun fact right now, every single state they grow grapes. Every single state has a vineyard.
And Jennifer, I want to bring you back to the conversation because we're talking about land. We're talking about sort of expectations and what we think we know about wine and grapes and just properties. And as a historian, you shared a little bit earlier about your own journey into the history of wine, but why the history of wine and what surprised you the most when you started getting into it?
I think what surprised me the most when I started looking at wine and colonialism is that wine was there from the start. So, for example, when the Dutch arrive in South Africa, what becomes South Africa, in the 1600s, they almost immediately tried to plant a vineyard. The same thing with the British in Australia. There's something called the First Fleet, which is this group of ships that go to Australia bringing convicts in 1788. They also brought vines with them. And one of the first jobs was to plant a small vineyard. And I realized this was for a few things. And this surprised me a lot because these are people, British people, Dutch people, who don't have a lot of experience in growing grapes, probably haven't seen grapes grown before. They're doing it mostly from manuals. But I think they're doing it for a few reasons. One is that they want to have their own supply of wine because it's difficult and expensive to ship wine very long distances, especially in the 18th century. And also that they think, well, this could be a potential crop, something that will really help boost this new economy here. So we should really get going on making wines. And I think they also see it as a sign of civilization.
Mm.
And I want to go back to Donna's point about wine being associated with snobbery.
Mm.
We think of it as this kind of high class endeavor, and that's because wine is expensive.
Right.
And also because the wine industry has created a whole culture around wine consumption that says you have to do things in certain ways. And that makes it feel exclusive and a bit intimidating. What's my point here?
Talking about how land impacts the way we see wine or our history. And actually, on that note, great segue, by the way, is we're going to go back in time a little bit because like you mentioned, wine I think has a longer history than we know, or maybe a history that we thought we knew, but it's not what we thought it was. Because in your book, you wrote about Thomas Jefferson's connection to wine. And so, what do we know about his winemaking history? Because it's not the romantic wine history that we like it to be, I think.
Well, so as you say, wine is often all about place. The way wine professionals talk about wine, they talk about place, and they often use the French term terroir, which means that something tastes of the specific place that it comes from. So you can say, oh, this area has a particular terroir, it has a special taste. And that's something that winemakers often try to capture. They want their wine to taste of the place where they made it because it's an agricultural product and it's unique. Unless you're doing a kind of mass-produced wine and you don't really care what it tastes like as long as people buy it, you're trying to express place. And so we often dig down on place and try to express that in wine marketing. So the story of Virginia wine and American wine is often in marketing speak, Thomas Jefferson, founding father, is the father of American wine, and he made wine at his Virginia estate. And then the wine label continues, and today, such and such vineyard continues in this proud tradition. Jefferson was inspired by the French wines of Bordeaux that he loved and imported, and we respect that tradition today. And that is, while not exactly false, a kind of misleading narrative. Thomas Jefferson did have a fascination with agriculture, with horticulture. He did grow grapes and attempt to make wine at his plantation in Virginia. But let's be clear, he wasn't providing the labor. He wasn't actually doing the work. He was putting up the capital and he had the vision, but he was asking enslaved people to do all the work for him. And I think that matters because when you think about a place like Virginia, people who are making wine in Virginia today, just as we have people making wine in Connecticut today, are somehow seen as kind of upstarts, people who have come along quite recently and are just getting on this trend because everybody likes wine. It's more popular than ever. But actually, there's a much longer and more complex history of lots of different kinds of people being involved in wine production. And I think we need to recognize that because it changes how we view people in the industry today. You know, they're not parvenus, they're not Johnny-come-latelys. They're actually people who are reclaiming a history, which has really been ignored.
And with that in mind, too, because you also mentioned New World wine. What does that mean when we hear New World wine?
So I think for some wine professionals, New World wine can mean a wine style, bold, brash, perhaps less refined than the so-called Old World wines. So compare like a really bold Australian wine to a more delicate French wine. For some people, New World means the wine producers that have become big exporters in the second half of the 20th century. That's where they came to kind of the wine industry's critical attention. For me, though, I think we should redefine New World of wine and we should use it to understand those countries where their wine industries were established through colonialism. Because, one, that's true and accurate. And also, I think it has an advantage to the wine industry today in that allows for a more inclusive narrative. And that helps more types of consumers and winemakers to see their own place in history.
Well, and Marissa, as a wine seller too, what can you respond to what we're hearing from Jennifer about the history of wine?
One of the things that has been really fascinating is that Jennifer teaches a course about the history of wine. And what you realize in that course is that it kind of fills in the spaces between the words on the back of a wine label, in the sense that the course goes into academic research and really tells you what is going on. And that has informed perhaps what I teach in wine courses. So when somebody comes to me and says, can we do a wine tasting, a wine class about, white Bordeaux? And then I can talk about what happened in Bordeaux, and I can talk about how it happened in Burgundy, both from, let's say, a marketing standpoint and what we've come to know from the wineries themselves. But then on the opposite side, I can talk about the academic research that has been done about economics, about cultural history, and all of these things. And that has been important. The other thing that I was thinking about was that the knowledge that I have acquired about wine, because it has often been thought of as kind of a little bit snobbish, has actually opened doors. So if I talk about wine somewhere and somebody all of a sudden overhears it, people will all of a sudden turn and say, oh, can you tell me a little bit more about that? Or have you been to Bordeaux, or have you been to this? So there is something about knowing about wine that does open doors, because it isn't, I want to say it's kind of information or knowledge that not everybody knows. And what I try to do in classes is make that more accessible. So when we talk about flavors, I tell people to go into their spice cabinet and just smell all of those things, and kind of it's a memory thing. And so there is the difference between being very technical about wine and then trying to talk to people about it. And I often say that I'm a translator or an interpreter of what people say when they come in, and then my job is to kind of like look at the wall and figure out what are they really saying when they're talking about tart, or when they're talking about I don't like it too big, or I don't like it to be fruity. Are they really talking about fruit, or are they talking about sugar and that kind of thing? So taking all of that information and kind of then being able to talk to people for about 30 seconds and understand what it is that they want.
Right. And 30 seconds is a very short time, which is what I'm going to ask Donna to do here, actually, as a wine maker too. I love what Marissa said about, wine opens doors, which is, I think, a theme here as well. And how being a translator is really important between yourself and your customer. Donna, what do you have to say in terms of what Marissa has to say?
I would say it does open doors, but I also want to say that for us, I feel that, especially now, you have the younger generation coming in, and they realize you don't, one is not snobbish. You don't have to be a snob about it. And even though if it's expensive or unexpensive, wine is in the taste of the person tasting it. It tastes good to you, it's good to you. And it doesn't have to be $100 bottle or a $50 bottle. It could be a $10 bottle. So I think wine is now coming to the forefront where it's slowly getting away from that snobbish part of it, but we still have those people out there who feel that is the only way you can taste wine. That is the only way, by knowing where it's from and what's the terroir and what's this and what you smell in it and what, legs. Who says legs anymore? I haven't heard that in years.
I was actually told that was not a real thing.
It is not a real thing. It's the sugar level, and it's ridiculous.
Well, I love this. We're going to be continuing the wine translations in this hour. Our guests today are Marissa Cascio and Donna Moore, and we're also hearing from Trinity professor Jennifer Reagan-Lefebvre. We will be continuing the translation of wine coming up. You can also join the conversation. Listeners, let us know if you have any questions. Leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're talking about wine. Not drinking it, just talking about it. We promise, because it's a little early. But if you pick up a bottle of wine today, spend some time reading that little label on the back of it. Those labels are often mini stories about the vineyard that the wine comes from. They could also give a glimpse of the industry's complexity. Today, we have Jennifer Reagan-Lefebvre, who's a professor of history at Trinity College, and she's also the author of the book Imperial Wine: How the British Empire Made Wine's New World. We also have Marissa Cascio, who's the director of education at Center Wine and Spirits in Glastonbury. We also have Donna Moore with us, who's the co-owner and winemaker for Sunset Hill Vineyard in Lyme here in Connecticut. So Jennifer, we've been talking a lot about history of wine. Where did wine come from? How did it get here? And how, with so much wine being written about, was made and consumed by maybe one particular group. Can you talk about what does it mean because of the process of that? What does it mean for what we know about the taste of wine? Does taste depend on who you are, what you've eaten, what your genetics, where you're from?
That's a great question. So my main area is the history of Britain, and people are always surprised that I write about wine because Britain is not a big wine producer, but it's been a huge wine importer going back to the 12th century. So, 800 years is one of the top wine importers in the world. So it's had a really important role in establishing language about taste and also determining what kind of wine sells. And nowadays, the two major wine education bodies, which also give out certifications, so that would be the Court of Master Sommeliers and the Wine Spirits Education Trust, they're both based in Britain. So they have an outsized role in determining how people talk about wine style. And as a result, and a lot of Americans who embark on wine education will notice this, there are some terms that come up that might be unfamiliar. And my favorite one is gooseberry. And Marissa's laughing alongside me because she said to me before, what the heck does a gooseberry taste like? Now, I know what a gooseberry tastes like. I'm a white woman of Irish descent who was raised in the UK. And it's a green berry, and it's something we associate with the taste, in particular, of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. And people say, it has a really strong gooseberry taste. But if you've never tried a gooseberry, you're thinking, what on earth is that? I would say also black currant, red currant. These are hard to find in the United States. Whereas in Britain, there's something, black currant juice is like what is to British children, what grape juice is to American children. You find it all over the place. So people know what black currants are. When you take this language and this education and move it outside of the country that produced it, you can have some strange reactions where people are like, how am I supposed to identify a fruit that I actually have never tasted? And Marissa said when she does education, she says to people, think about your spice cabinet. What are the tastes that you have there? Your spice cabinet might contain different spices to my spice cabinet. But to me, this fills me with hope and excitement because maybe I should backtrack a little bit for some of our listeners who are thinking, like, what is the big deal? And are people just making stuff up when they're tasting wine? The amazing thing about wine is that grapes can express so much complexity that you just don't find in other fruits. So you really can taste a fine wine, and you can have a kind of voyage happening in your mouth, on your palate, of lots of different kinds of tastes. And you can train yourself to be more in tune with these, to be more thoughtful about them. But then again, it's all going to depend on your reference points.
It does. And, you know, it's funny because I finally kind of figured out that gooseberry is closer to a Puerto Rican fruit or a Hispanic fruit called grosella, which is this green little fruit. So I think of it as I take the WSET tasting grid, as they call it, and my job is to figure out, like, whoever I'm talking to, what is their cultural background, and how can I interpret it so that they understand or are closer to understanding what I'm talking about. So, you know, it's not just looking, you're right about the spice cabinet. Mine might look different than yours, but what it does is it also heightens people's awareness of what they're smelling and tasting. So in a sense, it almost doesn't matter what's in the spice cabinet as long as you're being aware of what you're tasting, in a sense.
Well, I love your phrase, Jennifer, voyage in your mouth, because I always get really excited when I can recognize a flavor. And then it blew my mind. I mean, with this conversation is this idea of like, you should know what these flavors are, but actually, what is a gooseberry? That's such a great question. And Donna, I think you wanted to chime in. Donna?
Yeah, I did. I think it's interesting because when you go wine tasting, in general, and some places, even here in Connecticut, they want to list this wine has notes of this, 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 and this. Goes well with steak and goes well with this. One thing we do not do at our vineyard, because I know in Central Coast at the vineyards we would go to, which are the boutique vineyards, which is what we pride ourselves on because we're a smaller vineyard, is that we're not going to tell you what we taste or what you taste because it's exactly like the ladies were saying. It's a spice cabinet in your mouth. You taste and smell what you want to taste and smell. Every single person is different. And I've seen husband and wives, they, of course, they're eating at the same table. They're smelling the same smells in their home. They smell the wine, taste the wine, completely different for them. So I think it's great that it is a great way to say, think about your spice cabinet, but it's also a way for consumers to educate themselves online by just having that memory of this is what I smell in this Cab Franc. This is what I smell in this Chardonnay. You may smell butter. Another person may say, I smell oak. Guess what? We're stainless steel. But this is what they have in their head.
Well, and this next question I want to pose to all three of you, but Donna, I think I'm going to start with you first because you are talking about that sort of sensory traveling, because we've been talking about wine's relationship with land. Is wine also about memory? Because sometimes certain taste and smell, I think we've all had that experience where, oh man, that just took me to when I was a teenager, or that just took me to where, to a very specific place and time. So how do you incorporate memory and feeling when you're guiding people in tasting wine, Donna?
You know, we just kind of basically let them know where the grapes are from. We grow 3 varietals, and we have brought in grapes from Paso Robles, where there's a lot there. So we brought in Pinot Grigio and Zinfandel. And when we're pouring the Zinfandel, we let them know these grapes came from California, and they come here from California, freshly picked, and we do the rest of the winemaking process. People who've been to Central Coast immediately say, oh my God, this takes me back to Paso Robles. Some of them don't even know where it's from, but immediately they can smell it and you taste it, and it takes you back to that moment of travel where you were, where you first tasted that particular grape.
And Marissa, you're nodding. So talk about wine with memory. What's your take on that?
It's interesting because sometimes we get people in the shop who come in and say, I brought this bottle of wine back from vacation. I was in Capri and it just doesn't taste the same. And I tell them that there's so many other things while you were drinking that bottle of wine in Capri, right? There's sun, there's surf, there's salt, there's the food and everything. So it's not going to taste exactly the same now that you're back in the suburbs of Connecticut, you know? And the other thing I tell people is that you have to drink what you like, and I'm there to serve them. And so often, sometimes we'll come in and say, you know, I should be drinking red wine, or I should be drinking white wine, or I know I should be liking dry wine, but I really love Moscato. And so I say you should drink Moscato if you like Moscato. And if you want to know more about Moscato, or if you want to elevate your game, so to speak, of Moscato, I'm here to do that. But you can drink whatever you want. You know, I think that's the thing that happens with a lot of people. And I think what's happened in general with wine, with this snobbish idea, is that there are these rules that are unbreakable. And the fact is that they are completely breakable. There's no one kind of like standing guard, so to speak.
So more of the story here is break all the rules, everyone. Well, and Jennifer, what are your ideas about the relationship between wine and memory and taste?
I think it's really important because tasting wine is always a multi-sensory experience. In fact, when you learn to taste wine, the first thing you do is you look at it. You know, before you even start to smell it, before you taste it, you look at the color, you look at the clarity. And this is all setting you up to taste, but it's part of, I think, building the memory as well. But the wine industry knows this, and this is why they incorporate wine history in their marketing of wine, because history gives a sense of legitimacy, it gives a sense of authenticity, it gives a credibility to wine. You know, to say that a winery is built on a winery that's been there for 200 years gives a sense of credibility to the product that they're marketing. So I think memory is really important. Where I get concerned is where I see, you know, bad history being employed to market wine.
And is that something that you're still seeing often, or what do you do when you realize that's still happening?
You know, it's funny. I've been pushing back against some of the major narratives in wine history, and it comes for me from a place of really loving wine, really enjoying wine, and wanting it to be more inclusive, wanting more people to find joy in it. And also it comes with a certain historian's quest for accuracy. You know, if I see information when I'm doing work in the archives in a library that contradicts something that we think we know about wine history, I'm not going to not share that. To me,
Right.
that's exciting. That's a find. I do get pushback, though. You know, I have people send me nasty messages saying you're just trying to do woke history, or you're trying to write popular history because, you know, you're writing about things like slavery. And, you know, I never set out to write about slavery. I set out to write about wine. And there are things that I found along the way, and they became part of the story because they are part of history.
Well, and then very much part of the story and part of our history too is we've seen a lot of changes over the last couple of years, and in particularly with the killing of George Floyd has led many businesses to start thinking more about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so, how do you think that event has changed the wine industry? You know, Marissa, I want to start with you on that.
I am unsure. I've been in the wine industry for a really long time. I have seen a lot of initiatives, and I would say that you have to wait a bit longer to see what the actual changes are, that the changes are not in a way for marketing or publication. I have a concern about the depth of what those changes are, and that the changes are about diversity, not just in people and in language, but in also opportunity. So I'm looking forward to a longer term kind of rear view mirror look to see what happens in the industry.
Donna, I want to ask you to respond to that as well. You know, 2020 was also the time of the pandemic, and many vineyards were not able to have visitors. So, what kind of changes did you see there?
I totally agree with Marissa. It's waiting to really, really see the long term with change, the quick term with change. I can tell you for us in general, because we are the only Black owned vineyard in Connecticut, I did have Black wine consumers and companies chasing me down. Can you come and speak at our law office? Can you come and speak at our hedge fund? Where are you located? We want to do our event at your vineyard. So for the short term, I believe people here in Connecticut were trying to do what they could to support a vineyard. And even during the COVID, we had companies calling saying, can you deliver? Absolutely, we can deliver. So that was just a short term. Long term, I don't know. I really don't know either, because you do not see much advertising. There's no advertisement really at all as far as speaking on the conversation about Black owned vineyards or any kind of diversity with vineyards. So it's something that's still crawling. People are crawling, but they're searching. and they know it's there, and they just have to find us, and not just us, just any kind of vineyard with any kind of diversity in it at all. They just have to find it. And I do believe some people are trying to find it. It's just taking time.
Well, and not just seeing the social changes and how it is impacting the wine industry, we're also seeing climate change. So, Jennifer, I want to ask this question to you too. How are we starting to see climate change impact vineyards and also where wine is being grown?
In some ways, that's maybe a better question for Donna, but basically, some vineyards are becoming too warm. That is the general trend. And so people are moving vineyards usually closer to coastal areas where you have maritime breezes that keep them more temperate, or they're moving into higher altitude wines. That's happening a lot in Australia, where places like the Hunter Valley are getting quite warm. So people are now exploring building on mountainsides where it's cooler.
Donna, you want to respond real quick before we go to break?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. We're fortunate enough to be along the shoreline, so it's not affecting us. But that is so true. They're either closing a lot or they are just moving their vineyard altogether, which is a challenge.
But it's benefiting places like England. England is benefiting
Yes,
because it's cooler, and maybe it will benefit Connecticut.
and maybe it will.
That's part of the long-term plan that we're keeping our eyes on. So thank you so much for that. We're going to take a quick break here. Coming up, we talk about the spaces where wine is served, sampled, and enjoyed, and how to make them accessible to everyone. You can also join the conversation. Leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're hearing from winemakers and wine enthusiasts about diversity and inclusion in the wine industry. And as we've learned so far, wine is about more than just taste and tannin. It's also about community, history, and memory. And our wonderful panel is still here with us. We have Jennifer Reagan-Lefebvre, who's a professor of history at Trinity College, Marissa Cascio, who's the director of education at Central Wine and Spirits in Glastonbury, and also Donna Moore, who's the co-owner and winemaker for Sunset Hill Vineyard in Lyme, Connecticut. So Marissa, I want to start with you here. We've been talking a lot about changes in diversity and inclusivity in this wine space. We're talking about vineyards, country clubs, and even some wine and spirit stores. They don't always feel inclusive for some members in the community. So how do you think the wine industry could create spaces that feel more inclusive and inspire and uplift people who want to go to these spaces?
That is a really good question, and I wish I had a really good answer to that. I think it starts with companies investing time and money in places, and to go to spaces where people are, where you might not normally think of where people are, whether it's bookstores, cafes, and things like that. And, because we are a country with a 3-tier system, it's difficult to access places sometimes. But I think it's kind of meeting people where they are and not kind of like forcing people to come to you in a sense. And I think that's probably the best way to do it.
Well, and Donna, at your vineyard, you have tours and events as well. So when you're thinking about making your vineyard a place where everyone feels comfortable, what does that look like for you?
Well, for us, I think social media plays a big part. That's the biggest part. Social media is our friend right now. Just letting people know that you are out there. For a while, we would have social media, but it was never my face. Lately, my face, so people see, and they're like, "Oh, that's a Black woman." So I think it goes both ways. You have to meet the community halfway, and you also have to put yourself out there and let people know that we are here. And not just me and any vineyard of color. You have to just let people know that you're there and do what you can and work with the community and any kind of festival or whatever. Just put yourself out there because they don't know. I mean, there's so many people. We've planted 2007. We opened 2016. There are people who were just at the vineyard over the weekend and said, "I never knew you were here."
And Jennifer, this is a conversation, of course, for you that is ongoing and will continue. What are some barriers that you're still seeing that needs breaking, and just things that you're still seeing or conversations you're still having?
I think there's a reluctance to talk about race on the part, especially of white people in the industry. And I think, there are many people who are personally invested, and I don't mean financially, I mean spiritually, in the industry how it is now. People who have built up decades of expertise, and they are wary of potential changes. So when I say, oh, we need to be more inclusive, people get a little anxious and say, well, what does that actually mean? I think what it means is more customers, and I think that's a good thing. And to me, wine is ultimately about sharing. It's a drink that's meant to be enjoyed and shared with others. So I think it's really a good thing, but there is some apprehension there. And the other thing is that some of our ideas about wine consumption are just so deeply subconsciously held. I'll give you an example. When I say to my students, because I've taught wine history for over a decade, when I talk to my students about gender, there'll always be a few people rolling their eyes and they're a little skeptical. They're like, oh, do we have to do the gender stuff? And I will say to one of these people, usually a young gentleman, tell me, what's a girly drink? And they know exactly what that means. That term has resonance, even if they wouldn't use it themselves.
Sure.
The same way, if I go out to dinner with my husband, typically he orders a glass of white wine and I order a glass of red. 9 times out of 10, a waiter will come to our table and switch it, right? Because red wine is seen as somehow masculine and white wine is more feminine. So we have to be aware of and then start unpacking these very deeply held ideas about wine consumption as it relates to gender, as it relates to race.
Well, and especially with what you were just saying, there's so much interconnectedness, I think, with what we're talking about. But I also want to bring in the younger generation. So what are your experiences with the younger generation, and what can we do to make it more inclusive for them, Marissa?
The younger generation, especially where I am, are looking for natural wines, which are obviously very big with a certain set of people, so to speak. And
What
the younger
are
people,
natural wines?
Natural wines are, there's actually no legal definition from what I understand, but generally the phrase has been less intervention, so to speak. And so if you pick up a bottle of Chardonnay or Gruner Veltliner that is natural, it may not resemble the same thing that perhaps somebody like me who has done WSET training, that it might taste the same way. Now, it is wine, so when somebody comes in, it's my job to say this is a natural wine, and if that's what they're looking for. But I would say that natural wine is really where we're seeing younger people, and we're also seeing crossovers. I've been to some dinners where, we're seeing Concord grape as being, the wine that is being made, and we're seeing a lot of different things. So the definition almost of wine has kind of been expanding in it's not just grapes, but it's other things being added, and also the method that it's being made. So I would say that younger people are more open to the definition of what wine is.
Donna, is that something that you're seeing as well? More younger people coming to your vineyard, or are there more efforts to make it more comfortable for them to come in?
They're asking, they say natural wine, which is basically we make natural wine, organic wine. We have organic wine. We don't label it organic. It's basically the winemaking process and the materials that you use to make the wine. So we do have all of that. We are the first in the state to also sell CBD wine. So that's a big seller for the young people coming in, and not even young people, the older people come in more wanting that wine for aches and pains. So it's kind of interesting. I think it's just a challenge in general with trying to get younger people in, but they're there. They're there. Again, it's just a matter, you have to put yourself out there. We're not a stuffy vineyard. Catherine, you said you've been to Paso Robles.
Yes.
You know how the vineyards are in Paso Robles, very laid back, not pretentious. That's not us. And when they see that, young people are there and they love it. It helps. We have a record player on the deck, of course.
Well, hey, music and wine. What's better than that? So we have a couple minutes left. I do want to end on a lighter note, I think, and I'm really glad that you mentioned Paso Robles because that is a place I'm familiar with. And you're right. Like that's an area that made it more casual, more comfortable. And wine pairings with food is also a little different. We have wines that are good with burgers, with nuggets. It's not something that you typically think of. So I do want to end the show by asking each of you, what are your favorite wines and your wine pairings? Donna, let's start with you.
My favorite wine is, I love Bordeaux, and I can pair that with any kind of cheese, anything. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be cheese. You can pair it with anything.
All right, Bordeaux with any kind of cheese. That's opening up so many doors for, I think, many for our listeners right now. What about Marissa? You're smiling.
I love rosé champagne and fried chicken. It is just a pair made in absolute heaven.
How did you discover that?
I think a little bit by accident, because sometimes I'm just like, oh, this is what we have open. But I just think that the rosé and the bubbles just play really nicely off the fried chicken, and it's enjoyable. I don't really have to kind of do a deep dive into like, oh, why does this go together? It just tastes good.
Actually, one of my friends is determined to he's on a mission that rosé is for all seasons and not just for summer. Everyone's thumbs upping me right now, so just FYI, everyone. Jennifer, what about you? Favorite wine pairing and food?
This is like asking me to choose my favorite
I know
child.
it's really a bad question.
So unfair, but because it's summer and I'm feeling like maritime vibes, I'm going to go with Quincy, French Loire white, which is spelled Quincy, which is delicious, and I'm going to pair it with oysters.
Oh, okay. A classic. So we got about a minute here. So I kind of want to do a rapid fire. Jennifer, we'll start with you. Anything that you want our listeners to take away from this conversation today?
I mean, buy my book or get it from your local library.
Imperial Wine by Jennifer Reagan-Lefebvre, everyone. Marissa, what about you?
I would say that come in and talk about whatever it is that you want about wine and just make it known what it is that you like and you want, and let the person help you.
And Donna, any final thoughts? What would you like our listeners to get from this conversation today?
Smell what you smell in wine. Taste what you taste in wine. Just drink the wine and enjoy it.
Well, it sounds like our theme today is just drink what you love and taste what you taste and find what's comfortable for you. I'm getting a lot of nodding. So thank you so much for all of your amazing insight today. I want to thank our amazing wine lovers this hour. You were listening to Jennifer Reagan-Lefebvre, who's a professor of history at Trinity College, and she's also the author of the book Imperial Wine. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for being with us today.
My pleasure.
We've also had with us Marissa Kesio, who's the Director of Education at Central Wine and Spirits in Glastonbury. Thank you so much, Marissa, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me here.
And you were also listening to Donna Moore, who's a winemaker at Sunset Hill Vineyard in Lyme, Connecticut. Donna, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for listening and joining for our show. Cheers to you and all of your endeavors. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Bradley O'Connor. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening.